They demanded everything. The land restored to its original state, every penny of damage repaid, and a binding agreement that my property would never again fall under HOA control. Until then, I told them they'd better get used to hauling bottled water. By the next morning, the consequences were impossible to ignore. Faucets ran dry, toilets wouldn't flush, kitchens fell silent, lawns wilted in the heat, and pools went cloudy. But the real surprise wasn't the discomfort, it was the fallout. Instead of blaming me, as Victoria had hoped, many began pointing fingers at the HOA for creating the mess. Robert and Claire Wilson, longtime residents who'd always admired the peaceful charm of the land, organized a meeting independent of the board and asked me to attend. The hall was packed. I didn't show up in a suit or with rehearsed words. I came straight from the fields, boots caked with dirt, sleeves rolled up, the same way I'd shown up for work every day. I wasn't there to settle scores. I brought receipts. Maps Victoria had hidden, doctored paperwork, and surveillance footage of the destruction. What shook the room most was the financial trail. HOA money, dues from every household, had funded the illegal grab. I told them I wasn't out to punish families. I just wanted to protect what 5 generations had built. That night, the story broke on local news. It turned out Victoria's husband had received $250,000 in developer stock right before demolition, an undeclared and deeply unethical conflict of interest. Within 72 hours, public opinion flipped. A petition to remove the board gained overwhelming support. Nearly 9 out of 10 residents signed. I stopped being seen as a troublemaker. People started calling me a protector. The county judge convened an emergency hearing. The room was full again. But now, neighbors wore handmade pins reading, "Caldwell Farm Forever." Victoria entered with a legal team in tailored suits. I brought the truth in manila folders. Judge Mendoza didn't mince words. She called it one of the worst property rights violations she'd ever seen. She upheld my claim to water access and lambasted the falsified paperwork. Criminal proceedings, she warned, were likely. That same day, a newly appointed board, led by the Wilsons, agreed to every one of my terms. The barn would be rebuilt to the last beam, damages fully paid, and the HOA would never again have jurisdiction over my property. The moment ink dried on the agreement, I restored water to the community. The judge added a protective buffer zone. No building within 100 feet of my borders. As I walked out of the courthouse, something had changed. Neighbors approached not with judgment, but with appreciation. Offers to help came from every direction. What started as a legal fight had become a deeper shift in how the neighborhood saw itself. Victoria stepped down soon after. Her house went on the market. An ethics investigation followed, and her law license was suspended. Meanwhile, the new board worked with me to preserve the land. Where others once saw a roadblock, they now saw opportunity. The fields were planted again, this time with dozens of helping hands. Residents who had never farmed helped sow heirloom seeds and mend fences. They helped raise the barn from scratch using old tools and older methods. A small learning center was added, where students could study sustainability and heritage farming. Every month, we held shared dinners, made from crops grown right here. The tradition became so beloved that nearby neighborhoods followed suit. The developers pulled out of the project, and new legislation was introduced to protect other family farms, named unexpectedly in my honor. I came to understand that property isn't just lines on a map. It's memory, it's meaning, and it's vulnerable when power goes unchecked. Victoria had treated authority like a weapon, and it almost cost the neighborhood its heart. But once the truth was visible, people chose conscience over convenience. The ordeal forced everyone to re-examine their values. Was it order and control that made a neighborhood, or history and connection? In the end, most chose roots, and the land they once overlooked became a symbol of who they wanted to be. I also came to admire the wisdom of those who came before me. My grandfather didn't fight for water rights just to irrigate crops. He fought to guard something intangible but lasting. He understood that good land and clean water were more than assets, they were inheritance. In rebuilding what was nearly taken, we built something stronger. The farm and its people now thrive side by side. My neighbors know where their food comes from, and I see more clearly what they were trying to preserve, too. If there's one thing this taught me, it's that true leadership isn't about wielding control. It's about tending relationships, honoring history, and making space for both individuality and unity. When decisions forget the people they affect, they lose their meaning. Standing in that barn, built by calloused hands and borrowed time, I saw the full irony. The HOA had tried to erase the past. Instead, they helped write a new chapter. They thought they could bulldoze legacy. But some things don't need defending with force. Just remembering is enough. Have you ever encountered someone so intoxicated by their own illusion of authority that they try to bend reality around it? The type of person who confuses self-importance with influence, who invents rules from thin air and expects the world to bow in compliance. I have. And in my case, that person, let's call her Carol Peterson, though in my mind she quickly became HOA Karen, picked the wrong man to pester. My name is Arthur Ainsworth. I live quietly, intentionally off the radar, in a cabin nestled deep in the valley. My work as a forensic accountant means I spend my days unraveling chaos with calm precision. Meticulous documentation, obsessive detail, and a stubborn devotion to the truth. I bought this land, every acre of the valley that surrounds my cabin, to be left alone, to enjoy the freedom of nature without someone else's rulebook clutched in my face. But Carol had other ambitions. The first hint of trouble came on a cloudless morning, when police lights splashed across the surface of the lake outside my window. 2 sheriff's deputies, visibly sheepish, informed me they were responding to a complaint about illegal construction and suspicious behavior. The complaint came from a Mrs. Peterson, head of the Lakeview Estates Homeowners Association. What neither she nor the officers knew was that Lakeview Estates had no legal claim, none whatsoever, over my land. That's because my land was Lakeview Valley. Every tree, rock, and stretch of the lake was mine. Her little HOA existed only in a cluster of homes on the very edge of my valley, like ants claiming dominion over a picnic table they didn't build. I hadn't shared that fact widely. There was no need. But Carol's nonsense was about to drag this quiet property owner into the spotlight, and I don't play games I can't win. Her crusade, born of delusion and control, was about to be systematically dismantled. If you've ever dealt with someone who thrives on imagined offenses, who lives to impose useless rules designed to feed their ego, then you already understand the unique irritation that people like Carol bring. But irritation can be useful. It focuses the mind. And mine was ready. After the deputies left, apologies and all, having seen the deed maps I presented showing the full scope of my ownership, I hoped that would end it. A minor misunderstanding. Case closed. I even considered knocking on Carol's door and explaining the situation calmly. But my instincts told me this was no mix-up. And I was right. Days later, a letter arrived. Sloppily designed, stamped with the Lakeview Estates HOA logo, and packed with pseudo-legal nonsense. It accused me of a variety of violations, like unauthorized siding, which, for the record, was beautifully aged barnwood, improper landscaping, meaning I let wildflowers grow freely, and failure to submit architectural plans for review. Fines were threatened, deadlines set. It would have been funny if it weren't so invasive. I called her. I tried the reasonable route. Mrs. Peterson, I said, your HOA has no legal authority over my land. Her response? A syrupy condescension. Mr. Ainsworth, all lakeside properties fall under Lakeview Estates jurisdiction. It's how we preserve community standards. Perhaps you're unfamiliar with local expectations. I tried to explain. She interrupted. She insisted the HOA bylaws were clear, long established, and unbreakable. She recommended I attend a meeting to get educated. That's when I stopped engaging and started investigating. If she wanted to wave around rules, I'd collect every single one. I pulled county plat maps, dug into property records, cross-referenced surveys. I looked into the HOA's legal registration, founding documents, officer listings, finances, everything. I wasn't just checking boxes, I was laying a trap. HOAs are typically non-profit corporations. They're filed with the state, bound by bylaws, and run by elected officers. So imagine my surprise when I found almost nothing. Yes, there had been a Lakeview Estates Development Corporation, formed decades ago by the original developers, but it hadn't filed any paperwork in over 15 years. No active board, no current nonprofit registration, no tax filings. It was, legally speaking, a ghost. Carol had revived the corpse of a long-defunct HOA and convinced a few gullible neighbors that it still had teeth. And maybe it had worked on people who didn't check. But I checked. As I traced the paper trail, it became clear that Carol wasn't just overreaching. She was pretending. There was no functioning authority, no legal framework, no charter granting her dominion over anything beyond her picket fence. Everything she mailed me, everything she told the police was built on illusion. I didn't respond directly, not at first. I let her dig herself in deeper. More letters came. One threatened legal action. Another claimed I was damaging the aesthetic value of the neighborhood. I documented every word. Then, at just the right time, I filed a formal complaint with the county. Attached were the maps, the deeds, the missing HOA paperwork, and copies of every fraudulent letter Carol had sent. I didn't just accuse her of harassment. I backed it with facts. The fallout was swift. County officials opened an inquiry. Neighbors began asking questions. Carol's name, once whispered with reverence by a few, started showing up in angry conversations and confused homeowner group chats. Eventually, the sheriff's office sent her a warning about misuse of county resources and filing false complaints. Her fake fines? Legally worthless. Her threats? Toothless. But I wasn't finished. I mailed every homeowner in Lakeview Estates a copy of my findings, along with a simple message. There is no legal HOA governing Lakeview Valley, and if anyone continues to pretend otherwise, I will pursue every remedy the law provides. After that, the silence was beautiful. Carol retreated from view. I heard she resigned from her position. The signs she'd erected at the lake entrance were quietly removed. And my cabin, once again, became what I intended it to be, peaceful, untouched, and governed by no one but the wind in the trees. Some people believe authority comes from assertion, but real authority? That comes from facts, from ownership, from patience, and from knowing exactly when to act. Carol tried to play queen of a kingdom that didn't exist. All I had to do was remind her who actually owned the land she stood on. 25 years ago, the entity known as the Lakeview Estates HOA had been officially dissolved, its status quietly erased due to inactivity and the failure to submit basic paperwork or fees. Legally speaking, it no longer existed in any capacity. That fact alone was intriguing. So what exactly was this organization Carol had taken it upon herself to command with such fervor? Was it an innocent, informal neighborhood committee inflated by misunderstanding, or something more cunning, perhaps even deceitful? Curious, I cross-checked the names of the original officers listed in the old dissolution documents against the current landowners in the area. Most had either passed away or sold their properties long ago. One name was conspicuously absent from the old records: Carol Peterson. She'd only purchased her home about 7 years earlier. She hadn't been involved in the original formation and clearly had no founding authority. I decided to dig deeper, shifting my focus to the county's land registry. I tracked the complete ownership trail for both my expansive property and the smaller lots that comprised the Lakeview Estates development. The findings were enlightening. While the peripheral parcels carried a handful of standard restrictive clauses, minimum building sizes, no commercial use, things of that nature, none of the documents mentioned a functioning HOA with any ongoing enforcement power. And crucially, not one word suggested their reach extended beyond the platted subdivision boundaries into the larger, undeveloped valley that now belonged to me. The turning point came when I stumbled upon a collection of aging, unfiled meeting notes buried in a digital archive of the local historical society. These documents, nearly 3 decades old, recounted the slow unraveling of the original neighborhood association. The language was unambiguous. The group had acknowledged its inability to collect dues, enforce restrictions, or maintain engagement. One entry stood out. The members had voted to formally discontinue the association due to insufficient legal authority and community interest. In other words, Carol was playing queen of a kingdom that hadn't existed in decades. She likely found a copy of the old subdivision covenants attached to her deed, noticed the outdated corporate name, and took it upon herself to breathe life back into the corpse, either through honest misunderstanding or, far more concerning, with deliberate intent to mislead. The violations she was accusing me of, the fines she was levying, the architectural approval process she demanded, all of it was fiction. There was no legitimate organization behind her. And judging from the absence of any official involvement, she appeared to be the only one enforcing and perhaps even profiting from this illusion. My annoyance sharpened into precise, quiet resolve. This wasn't just a petty neighborhood power struggle anymore. It was a theater of deception, and I had the script in my hands. I wouldn't go directly to the authorities or rush to involve a lawyer. There was far more satisfaction and effectiveness in dismantling her fantasy with nothing but facts and her own hubris. So I planned. Carefully. I started by collecting irrefutable documentation, certified land deeds, topographic surveys, legal dissolution records from the Secretary of State, and historical notes confirming the original HOA's collapse. I organized it all into a clean, thorough report, complete with a digestible breakdown of the possible legal ramifications of falsely impersonating an official organization and attempting to collect money under fraudulent pretenses. Years of experience with financial documentation made this an art form. I also took the time to quietly observe. I made a few slow drives past the cluster of houses Carol seemed to rule over. I watched her play her role, waving to neighbors, walking briskly from home to home, radiating self-importance. I noticed freshly erected signs at the neighborhood entrance that hadn't existed before. No overnight parking. Pets must be leashed. Standard rules, yes, but their sudden appearance lent credence to the illusion that a functioning authority was behind them. She was building her stage with confidence, and I intended to let her perform, right up to the final scene. The meeting she had so smugly invited me to would be my opportunity. She likely expected me to show up chastised, possibly eager to beg forgiveness or argue for leniency. Instead, I'd arrive armed with truth, timing, and an audience. As I prepared, Carol continued to overplay her hand. The first letter she sent was followed by a more aggressive second one, this time via certified mail. It demanded $250 within 10 days or I would face further legal action, including the placement of a lien on my property. A lien on land she had no legal claim over, from an entity that didn't even legally exist. It would have been laughable if it weren't so disturbingly manipulative. Clearly, Carol was used to people being too confused or intimidated to fight back. My lack of panic must have emboldened her. According to a conversation I had with the general store owner in town, a man who seemed to know a bit of everyone's business, she'd been very vocal about me. Apparently, I was another outsider who thought he didn't have to respect community rules, and she'd painted herself as the lone guardian of neighborhood order. She was spinning her story to anyone who would listen, and that was perfect. The more she talked, the more she tied herself to this imaginary power structure. The more threats she sent, the more evidence I had. She thought she was the protagonist, valiantly defending tradition. But the truth was coming. I wasn't just going to defend myself. I was going to expose her fiction, brick by fraudulent brick. And when that curtain finally dropped, it wouldn't be me standing in disgrace. It would be her. I had been refining my approach for days. The upcoming HOA meeting wasn't just a gathering. It was a stage, one Carol had set, unknowingly, for her own undoing. I pictured it vividly. Carol perched at the front, exuding self-importance, flanked by a few loyal neighbors who hung on her every word. She likely imagined she'd humiliate me in front of them, putting the rogue cabin owner in his place. But I wouldn't give her that satisfaction. I wasn't planning a shouting match. I wasn't even planning to defend myself. I would simply reveal the truth, methodically, precisely, like an auditor presenting irrefutable evidence in a quiet room. What made it so perfect was that she had summoned the moment herself. She had chosen the time, sent the invitation, called the meeting. In doing so, she had given me exactly what I needed. A forum. All I had to do was steer the narrative. To that end, I came prepared with clean, oversized prints of key records, land surveys, title deeds, even the official dissolution record of the long-defunct HOA. Visual proof, after all, has a way of cutting through even the thickest fog of denial. Every self-important letter Carol had sent only worked in my favor. With each one, she was unwittingly tightening the noose. I didn't need to retaliate or posture. I just needed to wait and strike with precision. My first move was subtle, almost mundane. A week before the meeting, I sent a letter, not to Carol by name, but to Acting Representative, Lakeview Estates HOA, care of her mailing address. There was no signature, no name, just a clean letter, mailed from a P.O. box I had opened for this very purpose. It was short, direct, and written in firm but professional language. It pointed out that claims of authority and attempts to collect fees were being made by a group calling itself an HOA, despite having no legal basis or jurisdiction. It mentioned that land records, incorporation documents, and historical filings were under review. It warned of potential legal consequences for misrepresentation and fraudulent fee collection. And it was signed simply, a concerned property owner. The letter served three purposes. First, it planted a seed of uncertainty. Second, it let her know, without naming me, that someone was watching, someone who understood the law. Third, and most satisfyingly, it tested her. Would she retreat, investigate, or, as I suspected, dismiss it in arrogant defiance? Word of her response came through the grapevine, specifically from the local store owner, who heard it from one of her more skeptical neighbors. She'd apparently laughed off the letter as the work of a troublemaker, likely that cabin fellow, as she put it. She made grand statements about legitimacy and the importance of order. She was doubling down. Exactly what I wanted. Her refusal to take the letter seriously ensured she would be more dramatic, more self-assured, and more overreaching in the meeting. She would dig her own hole, and all I had to do was hold up a light so everyone could see her standing in it. The day of the meeting approached. While she no doubt rehearsed her talking points and planned her admonishments, I spent my time making sure every piece of my documentation was pristine and correctly ordered. I chose my clothing deliberately, neat, clean, professional. Not a suit, but enough to distinguish myself from the scruffy recluse she likely envisioned. The meeting was set for a Tuesday at 7 p.m., held in the underused community hall a few miles from the valley. I arrived exactly 10 minutes late, deliberately, stepping in just as she was getting into full performance mode. Carol stood behind a small table that served as a makeshift podium. There were maybe 7 or 8 residents in attendance, most of them from her street, looking somewhere between disinterested and politely attentive. She was speaking passionately as I entered, emphasizing the importance of rules, of order, of preserving the neighborhood's values. Her tone was solemn, her gestures theatrical. Then she saw me. "Ah, Mr. Ainsworth," she said with a tight smile. "So glad you could join us. We were just discussing the importance of adhering to the Lakeview Estates guidelines, particularly in reference to unauthorized structures, such as your cabin." She paused, waiting for a reaction. I gave her none. She carried on, listing supposed violations, fines, and the generous opportunities I'd been given to comply. Her voice grew firmer with each sentence, clearly believing she was building an airtight case in front of an audience that would nod along in agreement. But she didn't realize she was doing all the talking and all the exposing. Then she delivered the final line. "So, Mr. Ainsworth," she concluded, "the Lakeview Estates Homeowners Association expects your cooperation. The fines are due. A remediation plan is required within 7 days. Do you have anything you'd like to say?" I stood slowly, carrying a slim leather case. "Yes," I said calmly. "I do." I didn't approach her desk. I moved instead to a small open area beside it. "My name is Arthur Ainsworth, and yes, I live in the cabin by the lake. But what you may not know, and what this so-called HOA clearly does not, is that I am also the managing owner of Lakeview Valley Properties, LLC. I opened the case and held up the first oversized document, a full-color survey map of the valley. "This entity owns all of this land," I said, pointing to the shaded region on the map. The lake, the surrounding woodland, the roads, and, incidentally, the land upon which your homes now sit, including this very building. The room fell silent, aside from the quiet sound of paper shifting. A few gasps, a few whispers. Carol's face changed. The certainty drained from it, replaced by confusion, disbelief, and a flicker of panic. "That's ridiculous," she said finally, her voice brittle. "But I wasn't finished," she stammered, trying to hold on to her unraveling authority. "Lakeview Estates has existed for decades," she proclaimed. "That's true," I responded evenly. "A subdivision by that name was indeed created, and a development corporation was once formed to oversee it." I produced another sheet with measured calm. "However, as per official state records, the Lakeview Estates Development Corporation was formally dissolved on March 12, 1998, due to failure to comply with filing and fee requirements. I raised the dissolution certificate for the room to see. There is currently no registered, legally recognized entity operating as the Lakeview Estates HOA. Her complexion changed visibly. Blotchy red patches crept up her neck as she struggled to respond. "There are covenants," she cried, her voice rising. "Yes," I acknowledged. "There are original restrictive covenants tied to deeds within a very specific portion of the subdivision." I revealed another document. These pertain only to basic building and land use standards within those few lots. They make no mention of an active homeowners association, no allowance for ongoing fees, and certainly no jurisdiction over the 500-acre parcel my company owns outright. I calmly laid her violation notices beside my documentation. "These fine notices and lien threats," I added, "are, at best, legally meaningless. They are issued by an entity that no longer exists, claiming power it simply does not have, over land it has no connection to." Silence blanketed the room. Only her shallow, uneven breaths broke it. This wasn't a shift in power, it was a collapse. Her carefully constructed illusion had shattered in a single moment of unassailable clarity. Her lips parted, then closed, then parted again. No words would come. All eyes had turned toward her, not me. The expressions ranged from confusion and disbelief to subtle amusement. Some saw through her now. Some perhaps always had, but stayed silent until someone else pulled the curtain back. "This is outrageous," she finally whispered, trembling, barely audible. "You can't just waltz in here and fabricate lies. This HOA is real. I'm the president." "Mrs. Peterson," I replied, my tone as calm as ever, "I haven't made a single untrue statement. Every detail I've presented is verified and part of the public record." I handed her the folder. Certified documents, property deeds, the corporation's dissolution certificate, county plat maps, the original, limited-use covenants. "Please review them, or better yet, have your lawyer do so." The mention of legal counsel seemed to drain the last bit of color from her face. Her fire had dimmed. What remained was the unmistakable look of someone cornered by facts they could no longer ignore or deflect. She glanced at the papers again, then at the letters she had issued. "But the fines," she murmured weakly. "Are invalid," I replied crisply. "They were sent under the pretense of a governing body that no longer exists. Demanding money while impersonating a legitimate organization could easily cross the line into fraud, particularly if funds were collected and funneled into any account not associated with a legal nonprofit entity." A man who had been sitting silently until now suddenly spoke. He was older, deliberate. "Carol," he said, his voice soft but firm, "you told us those dues went toward maintaining the road on our street. We paid you." The glare she shot him could have melted steel, but she didn't answer. She couldn't. Her empire, such as it was, had just been dismantled in front of everyone. This was no dramatic outburst, no fiery confrontation. It was a quiet unraveling, like a magician whose trick had been spoiled by a mirror. With nothing left to say, she silently gathered her things, hands trembling, and left the room without a word or a glance back. The others began murmuring, their curiosity piqued. A few stepped up to the table and examined the documents for themselves. It was as if a spell had been broken. Her power had always been an illusion, and now that illusion was gone. In the days that followed, the consequences rolled in like slow-moving thunder. The gentleman who had questioned her stood at the forefront, joined by others, initiating inquiries into the funds she had collected. It didn't take long to discover she had been depositing the money into her own personal bank account. Though the total sum wasn't vast, the ethical breach was undeniable. Law enforcement didn't press charges. She repaid the funds quickly, but her reputation was in ruins. Signs of the so-called HOA disappeared overnight. My cabin, once under siege from her petty bureaucracy, returned to a state of tranquility. Even the air felt lighter, as if the land itself had been relieved of her artificial weight. Her fall wasn't dramatic in the traditional sense. It was quiet, clinical, a clean break formed not by rage, but by undeniable evidence and methodical reasoning. Word spread beyond the subdivision. Others in the county heard about the woman who posed as the queen of a castle that didn't exist. Her downfall served as a cautionary tale, a reminder that authority without foundation is fragile. For me, it reaffirmed something I'd known through years in my profession. People who rely on fear and confusion are powerless when met with calm clarity and cold facts. Carol had tried to rule over a small patch of imagined control, unaware that the man she tried to intimidate owned the entire surrounding valley. That irony wasn't lost on me. Her need for control blinded her to the reality of what and who she was challenging. And sometimes the most powerful person in the room is the one who simply wanted to be left alone.